Well, we've been asking this question tonight. What can Jesus offer me that no one else can? I live, along with my wife Rebecca, who's here, in a little village just in the middle of England that you've probably never heard of. But you might have heard of the city that we live near, the city of Leicester. And that's because for at least 1 year, Leicester had a very good football team. And you might have heard about that story. In fact, I have an interesting relationship with football because although I grew up in Leicester, I actually started in life supporting the football team in Southampton because I had a friend who lived there. And then I moved to the town of Bournemouth and I started supporting them before they were any good. And then when Leicester City won the Premier League, I thought given that the rest of the world was supporting them, it was probably okay for me to support them too, seeing as I came from there. And so I ended up supporting 3 football teams. I like to spread my bets when it comes to sports. And generally that meant that at least one of my teams would do well on any given weekend, although last year it did mean that 2 of them got relegated. Although this year it seems that one of them might win the Premier League. We'll see. But actually, Leicester's also famous for something else. Along with the football, it's the first, or one of the first cities in the UK to have an ethnic majority, which means more people from a non-white British background than a white British background live in our city. And that meant growing up, my friends were from all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds and also, of course, many different religious backgrounds. You could find all sorts of places of worship in our city of Leicester. Now, I had been brought up to hear about Jesus and the Christian faith, but as I became friends with people from all sorts of different religious backgrounds, it made me ask questions like, why only Christianity? Why would I not adopt these other religions? Why not take the best of all religions? Why would you only stick with one religion? And actually, those are good questions to ask. Maybe they're questions you're asking today. It's interesting, when I was a student, people predicted that religion was going to die out. People assumed that new atheism was the thing that was going to take over. And yet, ironically, that's not happened, has it? Your generation of students are 50% less likely to be atheist than my generation were. There is a renewed interest in God and religion. Why is that? Well, maybe for lots of reasons, perhaps because, as we heard at lunchtime today, science can't answer all of the big questions of life. Maybe we've come to realize that if all that exists is matter, that nothing does therefore really matter. And maybe we've realized that secularism just doesn't have answers to the big questions about meaning and purpose and hope. But where do we turn? There are so many options, aren't there? So many different paths and spiritualities. Maybe we'd just pick and mix religion. I used to love the pick and mix when I was a kid. In fact, I still do. You could basically take your favourite sweets and your favourite colours. For me, that was the red and the blacks, definitely not the yellows and the greens. Why would you go for those? And can't we do that with religion? Just take the best perspectives and ideas from every philosophy and religion and boil down what you want at the end of the day? Well, I guess it depends what we think of religion. If religion is just a set of rules, then maybe adopt the rules that seem to work best for you. If religion is just a set of rituals, then maybe follow the ones that give you the best experience. But what if religion is ultimately about a relationship? They're harder to pick and mix, aren't they? Relationships demand some kind of exclusivity. I don't know if you've heard of this lady, Lamorna Ash. She's a journalist and writer who's written a fascinating book recently about her spiritual journey from atheism to, well, searching for answers to life's big questions. And it's interesting because she reflects on her own experiences of relationships in the book and how she wanted to try and keep all her options open when it came to human relationships. She said this, "The truth is, I'm not choosing to live a million ways. And it's naive to imagine each decision I make doesn't also shut down a whole host of alternatives." And then she talks about how she had wanted to be in a relationship with a number of people in an open relationship. But then she said it put particular limitations on what we could be together. Not just limitations of time, but limitations on my capacity to step towards them wholeheartedly. For them to do the same with me. When I felt, and they knew, that my attention was half elsewhere, I missed as many versions of my life as I would have had as a result of any other relationship. In other words, she said, I realized that I can't have hundreds of relationships and them all to be meaningful. Committing to a relationship places certain demands. What if it's like that with God? What if God actually wants a relationship with us? What if that demands some level of exclusivity? Well, where do we start then? Well, I want to suggest maybe start with Jesus. Now, you might think, hang on a minute, Michael, you're biased. You're a Christian. You've been invited by the Christian student group. Of course you're going to suggest that we start with Jesus. And yeah, okay, I am, let's be honest. But aren't we all biased to some degree? But actually, what I want to do just for a few minutes is to give you a few reasons why I think starting with Jesus in any spiritual journey is actually a really good place to start. And to do that, I'd love us to look at a section of this book that hopefully you found on your chairs as you came in this evening. And to look at a story that happens on page 42. As you're turning to it, let me just explain, this is our free gift to you. We'd love you to take it away. It's been produced to invite people to investigate the story of Jesus. It contains one of the earliest biographical accounts of his life, and there are some really good reasons to take it seriously from a historical point of view. We haven't got time to go into that now, but you might want to ask about that later on. But let's look at this story on page 42, halfway down from the verse number 17. It says this: one day Jesus was teaching, and Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. They had come from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal those who were ill. Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house to lay him before Jesus. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles in the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." The Pharisees and the teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts? Which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? But I want you to know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home." Immediately he stood up in front of all of them and took what he had been lying on and went home praising God. And everyone was amazed and gave praise to God. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today." Fascinating and surprising story, isn't it? Firstly, because of the way that they had to get this guy to Jesus. I often think, what did the owner of the house think when he found that his roof has been destroyed in an attempt to get this paralyzed man to Jesus' feet? But it's also a surprising story given what Jesus says to him when he finally does get into the house. Did you see it there in verse 20? Jesus saw their faith and said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." You ever occurred to you that actually that's probably not what he was coming for? That's not why they had just dug a hole through this man's roof. You see at the beginning of the story that Jesus has been healing people. In fact, in Luke's account of Jesus' life, we see that happens quite a lot. And so, of course, everyone is expecting, as this man is lowered into the house, that the next thing that happens is, if anything, a healing. And yet Jesus says to him something incredibly surprising: your sin is forgiven. And I reckon in those short 5 words, we see 2 shocking things: something shocking about ourselves and something shocking about Jesus. Firstly, something shocking about Jesus. And actually, it was the religious leaders who were listening and watching who noticed this. Did you see that in verse 21? They accused him of blasphemy. Why? Because Jesus just claimed to forgive this man's sin. And they knew that sin was ultimately against God, and so the only person who could forgive it was God. And so in claiming to do that, Jesus was claiming to do something that only God could do. And actually, this isn't the only time Jesus does things like that. In 2 chapters later on, he forgives someone else's sin. Back in chapter 5, he goes into a Jewish place of worship, opens up their scriptures, and basically says, "This is all about me, and I'm the fulfillment of it." Later on, he sets someone free from the power of evil, and he tells him to go and tell everyone else what God has done for him. Later on, he talks about how he has a unique relationship to God the Father and that he is his son. As he's dying, ultimately, towards the end of the book, in his moments of death, he offers the assurance of heaven to someone dying alongside him. And then, right at the end of the book, he accepts the worship of his followers. All of those things are the only kind of things you could say and do if you were thinking that you were God? Now here's the problem. How do you know whether those claims are true? Anyone, I could stand up here tonight and make those kind of claims, but you couldn't verify them, could you? And Jesus anticipates this. Did you see that in verse 22? He said, verse 23, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven or to say, get up and walk? In one sense, it's a lot easier, isn't it, to say to someone your sin is forgiven, because you'll never know whether it's happened, outwardly at least. You know, when your sin is forgiven, you don't change colour, you don't start hovering 6 inches above the ground. There's no way to verify whether that claim is true. But if you say to a man who is paralysed, get up and walk, you'll see very quickly whether that's happened or not, won't you? And here's the important thing. Jesus, in Luke's account of his life, doesn't just keep making claims that only God could say, but he also keeps doing the kind of things that only God could do. On this occasion, making a paralysed man walk. On other occasions, making sick people well. Authority over sickness. Authority over nature as he walks on water and calms a storm. Authority over evil as he sets people free from its power. Ultimately, authority over death as he brings people back from the cold and he himself rises from the dead. I'm aware that maybe there are some questions that come into our minds. My friends who are atheists might say at this point, but that's impossible. Miracles, resurrections, those things don't happen. Well, in one sense, of course, if there is no God and we live in a materialistic universe, of course those things don't happen. But what if there is a God? And what if Jesus is God? Well, in one sense, of course, that would happen if he was. I don't know if you've heard of the lady Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was a good friend of Richard Dawkins. Both of them were committed and convinced atheists until Ayaan Hirsi Ali encountered the Jesus that we're talking about tonight. They recently had a discussion, a very public discussion in New York. You can watch it on YouTube if you want. And Richard Dawkins said to his friend Ayaan Hirsi Ali, why can you believe this? This is ridiculous. And what she said was really interesting. She said, Richard, you believe there's nothing. And of course you believe it's ridiculous if there's nothing. But I've come to think that there could be something. And if there could be something, then maybe it isn't as ridiculous as you think. I have other friends, though, that might have problems with this idea of Jesus being God for different reasons. Because, as Muslims, they would say, but of course God can't become a human. Those kind of things just don't happen. That would be unfitting of God. But would it? Nabeel Qureshi was, for many years, a very committed Muslim until he encountered Jesus in a very dramatic way. And he used an illustration to explain how he had come to see things. He said, imagine you're in a river, or perhaps for you, drowning in the sea out there in the morning swim tomorrow. And you're drowning in the water and you're looking for some help. And on the shore, there are two individuals, both of them very smartly dressed. And you say, help, help, I'm drowning. And the first person says, well, I'm sorry, I'm just too smartly dressed to help out. It would ruin my suit if I got into the water. But the second person strips off his shirt and tie, jumps into the water and drags you to safety. Which is the greatest? The one that's too important to get into the mess and rescue you, or the one who's willing to throw off their garments and dive in to get you out? And Nabeel said, what kind of God is the greatest? One who stays distant in heaven because he doesn't want to get involved with the mess of our world, or a God who is willing to step into the mess to lift us out? That's the kind of God we see if Jesus' claim is true, a God who's come into the mess to lift us out. I mentioned Lamorna Ash. Later in the book, she comes to some conclusions about what she's discovered in her spiritual search. And I was really struck by what she said in her last chapter. She said this, I believe that God might have come down to earth as a man 2,000 years ago to walk alongside us and to help us with our terrible pain. Why? Because I can't think of a more beautiful story for how a God might behave. You see, if this is true, if Jesus' claim here is true, not only does it mean that there is a God, that Jesus is God, but what kind of God does that show us? A God who doesn't stay distant, but comes down into our mess and our brokenness and walks alongside us. Jesus' words in the story tell us something shocking and surprising about Jesus, but they also, just as we come to a close, they tell us perhaps something shocking and surprising about us. You notice when Piyush was sharing his story that the offer of forgiveness actually made him feel worse. Why? Well, because when someone says that they forgive you, it implies that you have something that needs to be forgiven. And that was certainly the case in Piyush's life, wasn't it? Now, when Jesus says to this man, your sins are forgiven, we don't know the backstory. But it seems to imply, doesn't it, that he had something that needed to be forgiven. In fact, Jesus teaches elsewhere that all of us have things that need to be forgiven. And although it might seem surprising that he doesn't sort out his physical needs first, although he does get to that, actually what Jesus realizes is that for him and for all of us, our greatest needs is not perhaps the one that seems outwardly most obvious, but the one that is inwardly most real. That all of us are not the people we should be. That all of us in different ways have failed to live up to our own standards, let alone God's. And we've hurt others and ourselves, and we've separated ourselves from the God who has made us. And yet, isn't it amazing that in those words, Jesus not only shows us that we have a problem, but he also says there is a solution? That he didn't just come to rub it in, but as one person said, he came to rub it out. He came to point out our problem, but also offer the answer, that we can be forgiven. But how? That question that Jesus asked in verse 23, it's interesting, isn't it? What's easier, to say that your sin is forgiven or to say get up and walk? And we said a moment ago that actually the easier thing to say is your sin is forgiven because no one knows whether it's happened. But actually in another way, it's the other way around, isn't it? If you read through Luke's gospel, you'll see that Jesus can do amazing things just with the words. He can calm a storm. He can raise the dead. He can heal the sick. But what did it take Jesus to forgive? Actually, it took more than words. It took something far greater. If you keep reading through this book, you'll see it took him going to Jerusalem and being arrested and tortured and ultimately executed on a cross. Because forgiveness doesn't just take words, does it? It is costly. And if you have had anything to forgive, to really forgive, you know that, don't you? Because when you forgive someone, you absorb the pain that you would want to pay back to the person who has hurt you. And ultimately, the Bible tells us of a God who absorbed the pain and the guilt that we deserve so that we could be forgiven. Forgiveness doesn't just take words, it is costly. And yet Jesus offers it to us. So what can Jesus offer us that no one else can? Well, firstly, he offers us not just a prophet who points us to God, an idea about God. He offers us God. And what kind of God? Not a God who stays distant, but a God who came and got involved in our mess. And a God who's come to deal with our deepest needs, to bring us forgiveness so that we can be reconnected with the God who made us and experience his love and relationship. What's our response to that? We've heard a lot tonight, haven't we? So I've asked Andy to sing us one final song, just to give us a chance to reflect on what our response might be to all that we've heard this evening.